Hey people, it's just Siobhan here dropping in at the start of this episode to tell you about a new sponsor we have at Knowing Animals. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to announce that Sydney University Press have jumped on board and are wanting to support the Knowing Animals podcast. Now, I love the University of Sydney. That's where I got my PhD, and I support the University of Sydney's press in its entirety. But there's a particular part of that press that I'd like to make listeners of Knowing Animals aware of, and that's the Animal Public series. Now, the Animal Public series, as the name possibly suggests to you, is focused very much on animal studies. The series is edited by Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, who you will know as a past guest of the show, and also the wonderful Melissa Boyd. And they already have published a lot of really fantastic books that we have featured many of them on this program. For example, they published The Flight of Birds, which we've discussed with Joshua Loeb, and they've also published A Life for Animals, which was written by Christine Townend, a former guest. They also wrote Animal Welfare in Australia, Politics and Policy by Peter Chen, who's also been a guest. And that's just to mention a few. So what I suggest you do is a couple of things. One is jump online and check out the Animal Public series at the University of Sydney. If you're an animal studies scholar and you're wondering where to publish your next book, have a think about Animal Publics as a possible publication site. And if you're able to order copies of the books for your library or institution, that would be fantastic. That would make sure that everyone would have the opportunity to read about animals, and it would spread the good word. That's all for now. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, this episode is actually coming to you from the 2019 ASA Decolonising Animals Conference in Christchurch, New Zealand. And it's just so wonderful to be around the ASA people. They are all gems. So this is a bunch of really committed scholars, advocates, deep thinkers who care a lot about animals. So I really encourage you to think about joining ASA. It's not expensive to join and membership is really important to the organisation's thriving. So have a think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, let's get down to business. As I say, we're coming from the Decolonising Animals Conference, and once again, I'm joined by someone who I've wanted to interview for a long time, but I'm not always in the presence of. So this week, I'm joined by Heather Fraser. Heather is Associate Professor in Social Sciences, QUT, and today we're going to discuss Heather's new book, which I need to say is co-authored by Nik Taylor, another wonderful scholar who's also at the conference. And the book is called Companion Animals and Domestic Violence, Rescuing Me, Rescuing You. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. It's absolutely fantastic. Welcome to the podcast, Heather.
Thank you very much.
So, Heather, why this book? What inspired it?
What inspired it was to bring attention to the plight of companion animals in domestic violence contexts. Yeah.
So can you start by telling the listeners a little bit about domestic violence? What are the things they need to know to appreciate the place of animals in this story?
Thank you. It's domestic violence you could think of, I think for people who are unacquainted with domestic violence, they might think of it as a woman with a black eye. A situation where people are under physical threat all the time. But domestic violence is much broader than that. It includes emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, and various other forms of abuse. And often survivors of violence often say that their experience of emotional abuse is actually the hardest to recover from. So in terms of other animals, what we've done, what we've seen as feminists over the last few decades is or really the last 5 decades, has been to push for the recognition of domestic violence as a public problem, not just a personal problem. And now we're taking it further to say, but you've got to think about companion animals in those homes, what's happening to them in those spaces, and not just as direct targets of physical abuse, but also being exposed to the emotional abuse, the control, and so forth. Because for some people, the idea that it's a one-off event and the person's very sorry for doing it and so forth, we're not talking about an argument that gets heated. We're talking about a coercive, controlling environment where the victims are nervous, scared to do the wrong thing, not quite sure of the regime, and where the perpetrator is very much in control.
Right. What a difficult and troubling scenario. So how do animals feed into this kind of domestic situation?
We know that I'm speaking as an Australian, from an Australian context, and there's an estimated up to 85% of households that have got companion animals. So our lives are interwoven domestically with companion animals, or pets as some people put it. And up until now, there's been a thing called the link. And the link is really about the link between human and animal abuse. But so far, the link has really been around saying that if a person is violent towards animals, it's a precursor, a worrying precursor, or a red flag to violence that they're going to perpetrate against other humans. And it sort of skips over the impact on animals. And our view is, back up. The animals themselves are victims in their own right and should be treated as that. So what we've seen is, time and again, we've seen animals, whether they've been the direct targets or witnesses to their loved ones being abused, exhibiting some of the same responses that we would see in human survivors, such as nervousness, sleep deprivation, anxiety, hypervigilance, appetite changes, maybe a kind of acting out or trouble with continence, a sense of fear, maybe hiding under the bed for days. One woman that we interviewed, for instance, talked about her cats being very, very depressed, and she didn't realise they were so depressed until she'd left that situation with her cats and looked back and thought, wow, because they weren't the direct targets. So our argument is companion animals or animals in the household where there is violence, we have to take their needs seriously. We have to see them as victims, survivors. We need to put resources and effort into helping them recover.
That's fascinating to hear you say all that, Heather. I feel a bit embarrassed to admit that it hadn't really occurred to me the thought that just even if you never have a finger laid on you as, say, a cat or a dog, to see a human member of the family being attacked or abused is probably going to be upsetting.
Yeah, very much so. And when you think about it, it took several decades. Once we, and it was largely the work of feminists who put domestic violence on the public map, but that was really for adult women for the most part. And we still had a couple more decades to go before we could see that children who had been exposed to abuse, even if they weren't the direct targets, exhibited some of those same symptoms that I've been talking about. So this is the next step, is to say that they too can be targets, and they also, just through the exposure, the sense of tension in the house, the not knowing what's coming, the intrepidation that you can feel, because domestic violence is often chronic, recurring, it takes many forms, and sometimes these animals are brought into the house as a sort of appeasement or honeymoon period for the human survivors. Often this means that women are left to look after those animals, whether or not they wanted them, and they're then scripted to be their protectors, whether or not they wanted them. And so that, for the survivors, if they have children, they have animals and themselves to consider, that's an enormous array of responsibilities that often they cannot protect everyone in that event from that violence because if they could, they would.
So your method was to speak to women who, am I right in saying, are survivors and who had companion animals in the abusive situation. What did they tell you?
We've done a series of studies. The main one that influenced this book were interviews that we did with women in very mostly impoverished situations, living on a sort of basic welfare arrangement, which we know can be very difficult to access and keep and live on. They told us many, many things, one of which was that during the process it could delay their fears for their animal safety, could delay them leaving or stop them from leaving. And if you think about it, if you're going through an abusive situation and your dog or cat or rabbit is giving you comfort, then you're expected to just walk away, turn your back on that animal and just go and seek safety for yourself and just leave that animal in that precarious situation. And of course lots of women and in some instances men would refuse to do that, quite rightly. So they worry about that. And some of the women who did have to leave without their animals had perpetrators or ex-partners or partners who were sending footage of abuses that they were doing to their animals, as if you don't come home, there's going to be more. We had various stories, quite harrowing stories. So there were very complex arrangements as well around trying to get housing with companion animals, which can be notoriously hard, especially if you're on a low income. And yet, if they had children, human children, that they were then having to go through the family courts for, the judge might say, well, you need to have your secure housing sorted out by X, or you risk losing custody of your human child. And one woman actually described how her son was removed from her, put in her violent ex's care, because she was living in a caravan so that she could live with her cats and her son. So the importance of pet-friendly shelters I cannot underline enough, and the importance of us really changing our attitudes towards housing affordability.
Well, I was going to ask you, are there policy changes that you think are real, immediate, winnable changes that could make the world a better place that you would like to see coming out of, say, as a result of this book, people reading this book?
That's a really good question. In Victoria and Australia, they have now legislation that allows private rentals to be pet-friendly unless landlords have to justify why they can't, so an opt-out rather than an opt-in situation, because until that legislation came in, there were less than 5% of rentals that were available that were pet friendly. So what we have is a lot of people smuggling animals in or living in their car and so forth, which is not ideal for anyone. So that's one policy I think is really important. Another is that any of the supported shelters, women's refuges, youth refuges, so forth, where possible, we think that there should be arrangements made and infrastructure created to ensure that the humans and the animals can coexist post the violence if they so choose. Other policies, I mean, there's some basic policies around increasing, say, income support so that people aren't living in poverty and can spend their money on vet bills and so forth. There's a whole array of other voluntary programs, vets doing pro bono work or people giving support, which is fantastic, but we need a much more structural response so that people have a right, not just a charitable response to this.
So Heather, how has your work been received by other people working in the field of gendered violence? I'm just thinking to myself, there's a lot of talk at this conference and others about intersectionality and thinking about the human rights and animal rights together and whatever else. But I know that in some parts of the community there might be a view that talking about animals in the same breath as women or trying to write animals into such a serious human problem is offensive or undermines the status of women in some ways. What's the response been from other scholars in the field?
The view that we shouldn't compare women to other animals, I was well aware of, but it actually hasn't come up in the responses that have been made to us, at least. I think there is that lingering thought, no one's voiced it directly, but I think there's that view that we haven't got enough money to deal with human survivors, so how are we going to deal with animal survivors as well? Where will this take us? What will this mean? That's a lot of pressure to put on shelter workers and so forth. I understand that, but they were some of the same arguments that were made about recognising children, even recognising domestic violence. I remember working 25 years ago in a women's refuge, and it was at the time when neighbours and others in the community were still really like, even offering a women's refuge was undermining the family because it allowed women a place to go, and that was spurious, that they were given. So I have a long history with knowing that sometimes there's a lag between what you find and what you want to happen and the community catching up. Having said that, we do have such a wide range of people who love companion animals, love their companion animals and others, that the idea that being part of an abusive home is going to have negative effects for any being in that, I think a lot of so-called ordinary people think, well, yeah, of course. When you spell it out like that, they think, yeah, that's actually quite an obvious point. But we haven't really thought of it because we're so led down the path to only care about humans.
Fascinating. Hey people, it's Siobhan here, just dropping in very quickly before we hear the 5 quick questions. Now, have you heard of the Tiny Beam Fund? If you haven't, you should have heard of them, and you're going to hear a lot more about them into the future. The Tiny Beam Fund is a US-based charity that exists for the purpose of encouraging and perhaps most importantly funding rigorous academic research looking at industrialised agriculture, specifically factory farming. And even more specifically, they're interested in critically evaluating and considering factory farming in middle and low income countries. But they've got a broad charter to cast a critical rigorously academic eye over factory farming in all its guises. Now, they currently have a grants program open. Grants are open now, and applications close on October 11th, 2019. You can apply for up to $10,000 to support your research endeavours. I have had a small grant from the wonderful people at the Tiny Beam Fund, and I really encourage you to go and check out their work and think about making a funding application. I can remember a time when it seemed almost impossible to get funds to do research into animal-related issues. And look, here we are, 2019, and we've got the Tiny Beam Fund that exists exclusively to facilitate academic research into intensive animal agriculture. So check them out. That's the Tiny Beam Fund, and their current funding grant falls under the title of the Burning Questions Initiative. Now, you can find a link to their website in the show notes, or you can put Tiny Beam Fund into Google and you'll get there. Get applying. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the show to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Carol Adams' Sexual Politics, Mate.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
It wasn't that long ago. It was about 7 years ago, and it was with Nik Taylor, and it was called In Good Company, Women and Companion Animals. And when I look back, it was quite a softly entry into the area, but it was quite lovely too. So that was what I wrote.
Was Nik one of your gateway drugs into animal studies?
She certainly was. Well put. Yes. She saw a photo of me on a website with my dogs, and she decided that would be her bridge into meeting me. And we've gone on 7 years.
Bless. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It would be Nik.
Oh, Nik.
But there is another woman I'd like to pay homage to, and her name's Angela Duvniak. And even though she doesn't publish much in animal studies, she's been a vegan for 30-odd years, and she was really, really supportive and persuasive for me becoming vegan and becoming more immersed in the politics of this.
Wonderful. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
The most important thing they can do is stop just talking about stuff, actually lending their support to organisations that have practical outcomes, and also being very reflective on the kinds of classifications that academics use that have long enabled the mistreatment of animals.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Domination. I'd get rid of it. If I could just be like Samantha in Bewitched, I could just wrinkle my nose and ensure that there was no domination. And I don't know exactly what that would look like in the future, but what I know is that's the core part of the big problem.
Wonderful. Well, Heather, what are you working on next?
There are two things. One is a book called Queer Entanglements, and it's led by Damien Riggs, and it's got Nik and another woman called Shoshana Rosenberg, and that's LGBT relationships to animals, but also a project I'm going to do on my own is furthering the dairy farmers, or the Cow Project, we call it, some more publications from the Cow Project.
Oh, how wonderful. And who else is involved in the Cow Project?
There have been some students that I've had on placement as social workers. Nik's involved, but this I may just write on my own.
Oh, fantastic. How can people find out more about your work?
They can go to the QUT, Queensland University of Technology website, and look up Heather Fraser, Fraser with an S. They could Dr. Heather F in Twitter, or the Animals in Society Facebook page.
Wonderful. Well, Heather, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can also follow us on Facebook. And don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.